I grew up in a house where everything already had a script, and my name was never written into the good parts. From as early as I can remember, my parents talked about my older sister like she was a finished product. Straight A's, college-bound, polite, predictable, and safe. She was the example. I was the question mark. When relatives came over, they asked her about grades and internships. When they asked about me, it was usually followed by a pause like they were waiting for someone else to answer. My parents didn't hate me. That would have required effort. They just managed me. Lower expectations, softer standards, constant reminders that I should learn from my sister if I wanted a stable life. By the time I was 17, the comparisons stopped sounding subtle. They were direct. Your sister understands how the world works. Your sister picked something practical. Your sister doesn't take unnecessary risks. Every sentence ended the same way, even when they didn't say it out loud. Why can't you be more like her? So when I told them, I wasn't applying to college the way they wanted, they assumed I was joking. We were sitting at the dining table on a Sunday night, the kind with no guests and no reason to pretend. My dad had his laptop open, helping my sister compare grad school programs. My mom was scrolling through her phone, half listening. I waited until there was a pause. I've already decided, I said. I'm joining the Navy. The room went quiet in a way that felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced this reaction for years. My sister looked up first. She smiled, but not in a friendly way. It was the kind of smile people use when they think they've just won an argument without trying. The Navy, she said, like enlisted. Yes. My dad leaned back in his chair and let out a short laugh. Not angry, amused. You're serious. I am. My mom finally looked up. Her face didn't change much, but I could tell she was already calculating how this would sound to other people. That's not really a plan, she said. That's something people do when they don't know what else to do. I told them I'd talked to a recruiter. I told them I'd taken the AS fob. I told them I'd already passed the medical screening. The more details I gave, the more uncomfortable they got, like facts were making this harder to dismiss. My sister crossed her arms. Do you even know what women do in the Navy? She asked. It's not exactly a career path. That's when my dad joined in for real. Let's be honest, he said. You're not built for that environment. It's physical, it's strict, and it's not exactly forgiving if you mess up. I said I understood that. He shook his head. No, you don't. You think this is about independence. It's not. It's about limits, and you're about to find yours. My mom sighed the way she always did when she wanted to sound reasonable. We just don't want you making a mistake you can't come back from. I asked her what mistake she meant. She didn't answer. My dad did. This isn't college. This isn't a phase. If you walk down this road and it doesn't work out, don't expect us to clean it up for you. My sister added almost casually. Yeah. You don't get to fail and then move back home like nothing happened. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing slammed. No one stood up. I just realized how prepared they were for me to fail. They'd already decided what my failure would look like and where it would leave me. My dad looked straight at me. If you're going to do this, he said, you're on your own. We're not backing a decision like this. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to explain. I didn't argue. I didn't list reasons. I didn't talk about benefits or structure or why the Navy felt right in a way nothing else ever had. I'd spent my whole life trying to explain myself to people who only listened long enough to disagree. So I stood up, pushed my chair in, and said, I leave in 6 weeks. My mom looked startled. You already signed? Yes. My sister laughed again. Wow. Guess we'll see how that works out. That night I packed in silence. Not dramatically, just efficiently. I folded clothes. I made a short list of things I still needed. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. For the first time, I wasn't competing with my sister or negotiating with my parents. I was choosing something without asking permission. The next morning, my grandmother called. She'd already heard. News traveled fast in our family when it involved something embarrassing. Are you sure, she asked? Yes. There was a pause. Then she said, good. That was it. No warning, no lecture. Just one word, and it landed harder than anything else anyone had said. 6 weeks later, I stood at the front door with a duffel bag and a folder of paperwork. My dad shook my hand like I was a distant relative. My mom hugged me quickly, stiff and distracted. My sister didn't get up from the couch. Good luck, she said. You'll need it. I walked out without looking back, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I already knew what I'd see. The house would be exactly the same without me. And that's when it finally hit me. I wasn't leaving my family behind. They'd already decided I didn't belong. If you've ever been treated like the backup plan in your own family, take a second and drop a comment. And if stories about real family drama and quiet revenge hit close to home, make sure you're subscribed. I didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't the beginning of my military career. It was the moment I stopped trying to earn a place I was never going to be given. I carried the duffel down the front steps and felt the weight settle into my shoulders like a decision locking into place. The air was cool, early morning quiet, the kind that makes everything sound louder than it should. The zipper on the bag scraped. The door behind me closed without anyone rushing to reopen it. The recruiter's instructions were folded in my pocket. Address, time, what to bring, what not to bring. I checked my phone once out of habit, not because I expected a message. There was nothing. No be careful. No call when you get there. Just a calendar reminder. I'd set myself weeks earlier. MEPS. Oh, so be. 600. My grandmother's car was already idling at the curb. She didn't honk. She never did. She just waited, hands on the wheel, radio low. When I opened the passenger door, she glanced at the bag, then at me. You ready? She asked. Yes. She nodded and pulled away from the curb. We drove in silence for a few blocks, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. At a stoplight, she reached into her purse and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a folded check and a note written in her neat, careful handwriting. It didn't say good luck. It said, you don't need permission to live your life. At the processing station, the waiting room smelled like coffee and disinfectant. A dozen other recruits sat scattered across plastic chairs, most of them staring at their phones, some with parents hovering too close. A few moms cried quietly. A dad clapped his son on the back like this was a football tryout. No one hovered over me. When they called my name, I stood up alone. Height, weight, blood pressure, forms initialed, questions answered. Each step was mechanical, impersonal, efficient. I liked that. No one cared who my sister was. No one asked what my parents thought. They cared whether I met the standard. By the time the bus pulled up, my grandmother had already left. That was her way. She didn't drag things out. She didn't pretend this was about her. I found a seat near the middle and set the duffel between my feet. As the bus doors closed, a thought crossed my mind that surprised me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. The first night of training erased any illusion that this would be symbolic or inspiring. The lights snapped on before sunrise. Voices filled the space. Orders came fast and without explanation. I moved when told, stopped when told, learned quickly that hesitation had consequences. No one cared that I was tired. No one cared that I was smaller than most of the people around me. They cared whether I followed instructions the first time. The first week, I learned how invisible you can feel in a room full of people. No one asked where I was from. No one asked why I joined. Conversations were short and practical. You were useful or you weren't. You kept up or you didn't. At night, lying on a narrow rack, I thought about the house I'd left, not with nostalgia, with distance. I realized how loud it had been there, even in silence. How every decision came with commentary. Here, silence meant rest. Letters arrived for some people. Packages with snacks that weren't allowed. Photos tucked into envelopes. Names were called out during mealtime, followed by cheers or jokes. My name wasn't called. I told myself it didn't matter. And most days, it didn't. I was too busy learning how to move, how to carry myself, how to be corrected without taking it personally. I learned how to take criticism without explanation and improve anyway. Still, there were moments, standing in formation while rain soaked through my boots, scrubbing floors after lights out, watching someone else read a letter from home and smile. Those moments didn't break me. They clarified something. No one was coming to rescue me. No one was going to change their mind and show up because I looked determined enough. This path wasn't going to soften anyone back home. It was going to harden me. About a month in, I messed up during a drill. Not badly, just enough to draw attention. The instructor stopped the line and looked straight at me. "Whitmore," he said. "You distracted, no, sir." "Then fix it." "Yes, sir." I fixed it. The line moved on. No lecture, no lingering glare, just correction and forward motion. That night I realized something else. Back home, every mistake I made had been cataloged, compared, brought up later. Here mistakes were temporary. You corrected them or you didn't last. There was comfort in that. On Sundays, during the short window, we were allowed to make calls. I used the phone once. I dialed my grandmother's number from memory. She picked up on the second ring. "You sound tired," she said. "I am." "You sound steady," she added. "I am." She didn't ask about my parents. She didn't ask if they'd called. She knew the answers and didn't need to hear them out loud. Before hanging up, she said, "Whatever happens, remember this. You walked in under your own power." I carried that sentence with me through the rest of training. Through inspections, through evaluations, through moments when quitting would have been easier than explaining why I stayed. By the time graduation day arrived, I didn't look for familiar faces in the crowd. I knew better than to scan for something that had never been promised. I stood where I was told, did what I'd been trained to do, and waited for instructions. When it was over, people hugged their families, took photos, made plans. I packed my gear and followed the next set of orders without hesitation. As I boarded the transport that would take me to my first assignment, I felt the last thread tying me to that front door finally loosen. Whatever version of me they'd expected to fail never showed up, and for the first time being on my own didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a baseline. The bus jolted forward, and I braced my boots against the floor, watching the base disappear through a streaked window. As if it had already decided I was replaceable. The motion settled into my body quickly. I learned early that balance mattered more than comfort. My first assignment came with a short briefing and a longer list of expectations. Show up early. Ask fewer questions. Don't be memorable for the wrong reasons. I was issued gear that didn't fit quite right, and a schedule that left no room for hesitation. The pace didn't ease just because training ended. It tightened. The days stacked on top of each other without ceremony. Reveille, PT, work. More work. Inspections that came unannounced, and corrections that came without explanation. Nobody asked where I went to school. Nobody asked what I'd been good at before. Rank, timing, accuracy. That was the entire language. I made mistakes. Small ones at first. A strap misaligned. A report turned in late by minutes, not hours. Each one earned a look that said, "Don't do that again." I didn't. I learned D fast, not because I was gifted, but because I didn't want to be noticed. Being a woman didn't come with speeches or special treatment. It came with assumptions. Some people assumed I'd need help. Others assumed I'd quit. A few assumed I'd complain. I didn't correct them, I just worked. There were moments when the silence from home crept in. Not loud, not dramatic. Quiet. Like a missing sound you only notice when everything else stops. After a long shift, I'd sit on the edge of my rack and realize no one knew where I was that night. No one would have known if I'd failed or passed or disappeared into the schedule entirely. That realization didn't break me. It stripped something unnecessary away. During a field exercise, I lagged behind for half a second too long. My pack snagged. I adjusted and caught up, but the instructor noticed. "Whitmore," he said, voice flat. "You slow, no, sir." "Then move like it." "Yes, sir." I moved like it. No excuses. No explanation. Just correction. The moment passed. That's how most moments passed. Brief, sharp, and done. On paper, I wasn't exceptional. My evaluations read steady, reliable, consistent. Words people use when they don't have anything dramatic to say. I liked that. Drama had never worked in my favor. What did work was repetition. Showing up when it was uncomfortable. Staying late when it wasn't required. Doing the job no one wanted because it needed doing. I stopped thinking about whether anyone would notice and started measuring myself against the standard in front of me. There was one night weeks in when exhaustion hit hard enough to feel personal. I'd been on my feet all day. My hands were raw. My shoulders ached in a way that didn't fade with rest. As I stood in line for evening chow, someone ahead of me joked about calling home and having their mom send cookies. I smiled without meaning to, then caught myself. After lights out, I lay staring at the ceiling, counting slow breaths. I thought about the dining table back home, about my sister's easy confidence, about the way my parents had warned me not to come back asking for help. For a split second, the idea of quitting flickered. Not as a plan, as a possibility. It would have been simple. Paperwork, a call, an explanation framed as realism. Then another thought replaced it, clearer and heavier. Quitting wouldn't prove them wrong. It would make them right without them ever having to say it out loud. That thought settled the question. I didn't become louder after that. I became more precise. I learned how to anticipate needs without being told. How to read the room before speaking. How to take feedback without carrying it into the next task. A senior enlisted member pulled me aside one afternoon after a long inspection. "You don't make much noise," he said. "No, sir." "Good. Keep it that way." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't meant to be. I took it as one anyway. Mail call came and went. Names were read. Packages handed out. My name stayed absent, predictable in its absence now. I stopped listening for it. Instead, I wrote short letters to my grandmother. Facts only. I didn't complain. I didn't dramatize. I told her where I was and that I was fine. She wrote back once a month. The envelopes were plain, her handwriting steady. She never asked if I was happy. She asked if I was learning. Yes, I wrote back, every time. As months passed, the uniform stopped feeling like a costume. It became functional, practical, something I put on without thinking. The mirror reflected someone who stood differently, not taller, just more settled. There were still moments of friction, comments made under someone's breath, doubts disguised as jokes. I let them slide. Arguing wasted time. Results didn't. During a particularly rough training cycle, 2 people dropped. One injured, one overwhelmed. Their bunks were cleared the same day. No speeches, no memorials. The space they occupied was reassigned. Watching that something clicked into place. This system didn't care about potential. It cared about performance. It didn't remember who you used to be. It tracked what you did when it counted. I adjusted my goals quietly. Not to impress anyone, not to outdo my sister in some imaginary competition, just to be competent in a place that respected competence. The night before a major evaluation, I sat on my rack and checked my gear one last time. Everything was where it should be, clean, ready. I felt calm in a way I hadn't expected. Not confident, calm. Whatever happened next would be measured, recorded, and dealt with. There would be no family commentary, no comparison, no second-guessing disguised as concern. As lights dimmed, I lay back and let the day drain out of me. Somewhere far away, my family was living a version of life that didn't include me. Here, my absence didn't need explaining. I closed my eyes, knowing exactly who I was accountable to in the morning, and it wasn't anyone who had watched me leave without standing up. I rolled out of the rack before the lights fully came up and pulled on my boots by feel, moving the way you do when you don't want to wake anyone or announce yourself. The routine had become muscle memory. Tie, stand, check, move. Time in the Navy doesn't pass the way it does back home. There aren't clean markers like semesters or holidays. Days stack, then months, then years. You notice it mostly in paperwork and in the way people start calling you by last name without asking first. My first promotion came without fanfare. A quick briefing, a signature, a change in responsibilities that meant more accountability and fewer explanations. I updated my records, sent a short note to my grandmother, and went back to work. I didn't tell my parents, not because I was being dramatic, because it didn't occur to me. They hadn't asked where I was stationed. They hadn't asked what I did. Reaching out to announce progress felt like restarting a conversation they'd already ended. Every so often, I'd hear things through the family grapevine anyway. An aunt mentioning my sister's engagement, a cousin posting photos from a holiday dinner I wasn't invited to. My parents were still very active, still involved, still proud. Just not of me. They never blocked me. They never sent a message saying not to call. They just made it clear through consistent absence that contact wasn't necessary. Silence became the policy. Work filled the space where waiting used to be. I learned the rhythm of my unit, learned which tasks mattered and which ones were noise. I learned how to document everything, how to ask questions without sounding unsure, how to speak up once and move on. I stopped thinking of myself as someone who had to prove anything. I became someone who needed to get things done. There were moments that tested that resolve. A holiday watch where the base emptied out and the phone stayed quiet. A long night shift when I realized I didn't have anyone to text just to say I was tired. Those moments didn't hurt the way they used to. They felt familiar, manageable. At some point, I noticed I had stopped checking my phone out of habit. I checked it when I needed information, not reassurance. My sister's life continued on a parallel track. Promotions in her field, photos in front of office buildings, family captions full of pride and hashtags about hard work and dreams. I never commented. She never messaged. Once out of curiosity, more than anything, I clicked on my mother's profile. The photos were curated. Birthdays, dinners, group shots that looked complete without me. There was no empty space where I should have been. I closed the app and didn't look again. The day I made second class came with a small ceremony. Nothing dramatic. A handful of people standing in formation. A senior officer reading names, hands shaking, pins fastened. I stood where I was told and focused on not fidgeting. When it was over, people took photos. Some posed with parents, some FaceTimed spouses. I smiled for a quick picture with a shipmate and sent it to my grandmother with a single line. It happened. She replied within the hour. I knew it would. That was enough. A few years later, another milestone arrived. More responsibility. A leadership role that meant my mistakes would ripple outward instead of staying contained. I spent nights reviewing procedures, double-checking reports, making sure the people under me had what they needed. I got good at separating effort from emotion, at giving clear feedback without softening it, at taking responsibility without making excuses. My evaluation that year was solid. Not glowing, solid. The kind that meant you were trusted. When the promotion list came out, my name was on it. Again, no fanfare, just a quiet shift in expectations. I didn't celebrate. I adjusted. Somewhere in those years, I realized I had stopped imagining my parents' reactions to my progress. I wasn't picturing my dad's approval or my mom's relief. I wasn't waiting for my sister to acknowledge me as an equal. I was building a life that didn't include their response. That didn't mean I was numb. It meant I was selective. I learned where to place my attention and where not to waste it. There was one afternoon after a long briefing when a junior officer asked where I was from. I told him the town. He said he thought he recognized the last name. Asked if I was related to a family he knew. I said, probably, and left it at that. He nodded and moved on. No follow-up, no curiosity. The world kept turning. The Navy has a way of stripping things down to what's useful. Over time, I realized the story I'd been carrying about my family wasn't useful anymore. It explained the past, but it didn't help me operate in the present, so I stopped carrying it. I stopped framing my choices as reactions to them. I didn't join the Navy to spite anyone. I stayed because I was good at it, because it made sense, because the rules were clear and the expectations were earned. One evening, after a long day, I sat alone in my quarters and sorted through old paperwork. Buried in the folder was a printed list of emergency contacts from my first year. My parents' names were still there untouched. I stared at the page longer than I needed to. Then I updated it. I added my grandmother. I added a shipmate I trusted. I removed names that hadn't been used in years, not out of anger, out of accuracy. When I closed the folder, something settled. The silence from home didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like confirmation. They had chosen their version of family. I had built mine around function reliability and people who showed up without being asked. The work didn't slow down. If anything, it demanded more. More attention, more judgment, more steadiness. I met it where it was. And as responsibilities stacked and expectations rose, the absence that once felt heavy faded into the background, replaced by something quieter and far more durable, the knowledge that I was no longer waiting to be recognized by anyone who had already made their decision. I slid the updated contact list back into the folder and felt a quiet satisfaction in how clean it looked. Accurate. That mattered. I locked the drawer, checked the time, and headed out because work didn't pause for reflection. The message came later that afternoon while I was standing in a hallway outside a briefing room skimming notes before a meeting. My phone buzzed once. An internal notification. I glanced down, expecting a scheduling change. Instead, it was a formal notice requesting my presence at a command-level ceremony the following month. Purpose recognition for sustained performance and leadership. Dress uniform. Guests permitted. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't filling in details that weren't there. The language was plain. No hype, no exaggeration. It named specific responsibilities, measurable outcomes, and the period of time they covered. The Navy doesn't do flattery. It documents. I acknowledged receipt and slipped the phone back into my pocket before anyone could see my reaction. There wasn't much to see. A steady breath. A small recalibration. Recognition meant visibility. Visibility meant attention. Attention meant scrutiny. I went into the briefing and did my job. Over the next few weeks, nothing about my routine changed. If anything, it tightened. Reports still had to be right. People still needed direction. Decisions still carried consequences. The notice didn't make me special. It confirmed I'd been consistent. I told my grandmother during our Sunday call. I kept it simple. They're recognizing my work, I said. She paused. That's good, she said. I'll be there if you want me to be. I do. She didn't ask about my parents. She never did. She understood that recognition didn't need an audience to be real. The announcement went public through a base bulletin and a short piece in a regional paper that covered military affairs. Nothing flashy. A paragraph. A photo request. My name spelled correctly. I didn't share it on social media. I didn't send it to anyone outside the people who needed to know. I showed up prepared the same way I always did. The day of the ceremony, I stood in formation with others who had been called for different reasons. Some were newer, some had decades behind them. We nodded at each other without talking. This wasn't a celebration, it was acknowledgement. The officer reading the citations didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He read what was on the page and moved on. When my name was called, I stepped forward, accepted the certificate, and returned to my place. Applause rose and fell. Cameras clicked. The moment passed. Afterward, people milled around, congratulating one another, introducing families, making small talk. I found my grandmother near the edge of the room, hands folded around her purse, eyes sharp and proud. "You did well," she said. "I did my job." She smiled like she'd expected nothing else. We were halfway through a conversation with someone from my unit when I noticed movement near the entrance. A cluster of people had paused, glancing around like they were orienting themselves. One of them looked familiar in a way that didn't belong here. My parents stepped inside, as if they'd been invited all along. My mother scanned the room first, posture, straight expression practiced. My father followed, adjusting his jacket eyes, already searching. My sister trailed a step behind, phone in hand, taking in details. They didn't look uncertain. They looked late. My mother spotted me and smiled the kind she used at community events. "There she is," she said, voice carrying just enough to be heard. I felt my shoulders settle. Not tense? Set. "Kara," my father said, reaching out a hand. "We heard about the ceremony." My sister glanced at my uniform and nodded. "Looks official." I didn't step back. I didn't step forward. I acknowledged them the same way I would anyone else who had approached during a professional event. "Hello," I said. My mother leaned in, lowering her voice. "We're so proud of you," she said, as if this were a private moment. "We always knew you'd find your way." I didn't correct her. Correcting would have turned this into something it wasn't. People nearby were watching, not closely, just enough. The kind of attention that registers tone without context. My father gestured toward the certificate still in my hand. "You should take a picture," he said. "All of us." My grandmother looked at me. She didn't speak. She waited. "We're heading out," I said, keeping my voice even. "Thank you for coming." My sister raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "Yes." There was a flicker of confusion quickly smoothed over. My mother nodded. "Of course, we didn't want to interrupt." They didn't leave immediately. They lingered, introducing themselves to people, mentioning my name, positioning themselves close enough to be included in other photos. I noticed how easily they slipped into the space, how naturally they spoke, as if the years of silence were a scheduling error. I didn't pull them aside. I didn't confront them. I stayed where I was supposed to be and finished the conversations I'd already started. As we walked to the parking lot later, my grandmother said, "That was interesting." "That's one word for it." "They didn't come for you," she said, not unkindly. "No. They came for timing." I unlocked the car and set the certificate carefully in the back seat. The paper didn't feel heavier than before. It felt the same. That evening, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mother, warm and casual. "Congratulations again. Dinner soon." I read it once and put the phone face down. The recognition hadn't changed who I was or how I worked. It had changed who noticed. And as I pulled out of the lot and merged into traffic, it became clear that attention didn't come alone. It brought expectations with it, some spoken, some assumed, all arriving at once. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and left it there while I poured a glass of water, letting the screen stay dark. The message didn't bother me the way it would have years earlier. It felt procedural, like paperwork arriving late and slightly out of order. At work the next morning, nothing had changed. The schedule was full. The inbox was worse. People needed decisions, not explanations. I moved through the day the same way I always did, but I noticed something new. A few more looks. A few more questions framed as curiosity instead of necessity. By the afternoon, the congratulations slowed and the assumptions picked up. Someone asked if my family had traveled far. Someone else asked if they were staying nearby. I answered briefly and redirected the conversation back to the task at hand. That evening, my mother called. I let it ring once before answering. "We didn't get to talk properly yesterday," she said. Everything was so busy. It was a work event, I said. Yes, of course, she replied quickly. We just wanted to celebrate you. As a family. I didn't respond right away. Silence does more work than people realize. We thought maybe dinner, she continued. Just us. Catch up. I pictured the table back home, the one I'd left without ceremony. I pictured the way conversations there always curved toward comparison, even when no one meant them to. My schedule's tight, I said. Well, she said lightly, we'll work around it. They were already nearby. They mentioned it casually, like proximity had always been part of the arrangement. My father texted later that night, asking what time would be best. My sister added a message in the group chat, complete with a photo she'd taken at the ceremony. The caption read, "So proud of you." I didn't reply. At work, the ceremony continued to echo in small ways. Someone forwarded the article. Someone asked me to brief a visiting team. My name appeared on a list I hadn't been on before. None of it felt unreal. It felt earned. It also felt like a line had been crossed without my permission. The next time I saw my family was 2 days later at a restaurant they'd chosen because it looked good in pictures. They were already seated when I arrived, menus closed, posture alert. "Kara," my mother said, standing halfway before sitting back down. "You look great." "So do you," I said, because it was easier than silence in public. My father nodded, smiling the way he did when he thought he was being generous. "We've been telling everyone about you." My sister leaned forward. People were impressed. "Navy recognition isn't easy." "No," I said. "It isn't." They talked more than they listened. About the drive, about the hotel, about how surprised they were by the ceremony. My mother mentioned how nice it was to see people treat me with respect. I took a sip of water and let that sentence sit. My sister asked questions that sounded curious, but weren't. "Are you still enlisted, or are you commissioned now? How long do you have to stay before you can leave?" "Do they move you around a lot?" I answered plainly. No embellishment, no defensiveness. At one point, my father said, "You know, we always wanted you to find something stable." I looked at him. "I did." He nodded as if this were a misunderstanding being resolved. The check arrived. My mother reached for it instinctively, then paused. "Oh," she said. "Of course." I paid, not to make a point, because it was simpler. Outside, my sister lingered, adjusting her jacket. "You should come home sometime," she said. "People would love to see you." "I'm home," I said. She laughed softly, unsure whether I was joking. The shift didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. A request for a photo, a question about my schedule, a comment about how useful it must be to have someone in the military. A week later, my father asked if I had any flexibility with work. He phrased it carefully. "Just a question," he said. "No pressure." "What about?" I asked. "Well, he said your sister's dealing with something complicated. Nothing serious. Just timing." My sister called that night. Her tone was different, less casual, more precise. She talked about paperwork, about misunderstandings, about how things can get blown out of proportion when federal oversight is involved. "I thought maybe you could tell me how this stuff usually goes," she said. "I don't handle that," I replied. "Not officially," she said. "Just insight." The word hung there. I didn't correct her assumption. I didn't reassure her either. I listened the way I'd learned to listen at work, for what was being asked without being said. Over the next few days, the pattern sharpened. My mother called to ask how seriously the Navy took certain disclosures. My father asked whether reputations mattered as much as facts. My sister asked if names traveled between departments. None of them asked how I was doing. At work, an unrelated briefing touched on compliance protocols, reporting standards, ethical obligations. I took notes like I always did. There was nothing theoretical about it. That evening, my grandmother called. "They've been busy," she said. "Yes." "They think you're a solution," she said. "I'm not," I replied. She was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe them clarity," she said. "You owe yourself honesty." The calls didn't stop. They adjusted. Softer, more indirect. A suggestion that my presence alone could steady things. A reminder that family sticks together when it counts. I noticed how often they used my title now. How carefully they said my name. One afternoon, I sat at my desk and reread the initial recognition notice. It hadn't promised protection. It hadn't granted leverage. It had acknowledged work done under rules that didn't bend for convenience. When my father called again, I answered. "We just need to know where you stand," he said. I looked at the paperwork in front of me, the policies open on my screen, the systems that didn't care about timing or pride. "I stand where I always have," I said. He didn't understand the answer. That much was clear. But understanding had never been a prerequisite for expectation in my family. And as the questions kept coming, it became obvious that the pride they were showing wasn't about the uniform or the recognition. It was about what they thought it could do for them. I closed the office door and pulled the blinds halfway down, not for privacy, but to cut the glare off my screen. The call with my father had ended 30 seconds earlier, and his last sentence was still hanging in the air like unfinished paperwork. "We just need to know where you stand." I turned back to my computer and opened the folder I'd already reviewed twice that week. Names, dates, contract numbers, nothing dramatic. Just a chain of decisions that didn't look good when laid out in order. The situation with my sister wasn't new. It hadn't started because of the ceremony. That was the part my family didn't understand. Problems like this don't appear overnight. They grow quietly, fed by shortcuts and assumptions that no one will look too closely. Someone had looked closely. I hadn't been the one to initiate anything. I hadn't filed a report or made a call out of spite. The information had surfaced through normal channels the same way it always does when compliance reviews meet bad documentation. My role hadn't been active. It had been unavoidable. Still, my phone kept lighting up. My sister called again that evening. This time, she skipped the warm-up. "They're asking questions," she said. "Real ones." "Who is they?" I asked. She hesitated. "People who don't need to be involved." That answer told me everything. She started explaining in fragments. A vendor audit, a contract extension that hadn't been properly disclosed, an assumption that because the work was completed, the paperwork could catch up later. She framed it as a misunderstanding, the kind that could be cleared up with the right context. "I thought maybe you could explain how strict this stuff really is," she said. "I can't," I replied. "You don't have to do anything," she said quickly. "Just tell me if this is serious." I thought about the checklist on my screen, about how seriousness isn't measured by intent, but by impact. "I can't advise you," I said again. She exhaled sharply. "You're not even going to try." "I'm not involved," I said. That's the truth. It wasn't the answer she wanted. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next call came from my mother. Her tone had shifted from pride to concern. "We're just worried," she said. "These things can spiral if no one steps in early." "Who do you think should step in?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "You understand systems," she said. "You know how people think." I let the silence stretch. "I understand my responsibilities." "That's not what I meant," she said. I knew. She meant influence, presence. The idea that my uniform could quiet questions or soften conclusions. My father texted later that night. "We need to talk in person." At work, the pieces continued to align without drama. A scheduled review became a formal inquiry. A formal inquiry triggered notifications. None of it mentioned my name. None of it needed to. I sat through a briefing where ethics were discussed in plain language. No gray areas, no exceptions for family. The rules were clear because they had to be. Afterward, a colleague asked if everything was okay. I nodded. It was. The pressure from home intensified. My sister sent longer messages, now more detailed, as if information alone might obligate me. My mother began referencing family history, reminding me of holidays and shared last names. My father talked about reputation, about how one situation could undo years of work. At no point did any of them ask what this put me at risk of. That omission landed harder than the requests themselves. I met my grandmother for coffee on a quiet afternoon, choosing a place near the base where no one would recognize us. She listened without interrupting, stirring her drink slowly. "They think you're the lever," she said. "They think wrong," I replied. "They've always thought wrong," she said gently. "This is just the first time it matters." She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't need to. She knew I'd already decided what I wouldn't do. That night, my sister showed up unannounced at my door. She looked tired, not panicked, calculating. She'd always been good at that. "I need you to hear me out," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. Not because I owed her space, but because I wanted the conversation to be clear. She talked fast, about timelines, about people overreacting, about how nothing bad would have happened if someone hadn't flagged it. "People like you," she said, stopping short of saying the rest. "People like me, what I asked." She corrected herself. "People with credibility." There it was. I waited until she finished. "You want me to interfere," I said. "I want you to help," she said. "They're not the same thing." She looked at me like I was being deliberately difficult. "Why are you acting like this is a moral issue? Because it is," I said. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Since when?" "Since I took an oath." I said. That ended the conversation, not because I raised my voice or made a threat, but because there was nowhere left to stand. After she left, I sat alone and reviewed the policies one more time. Not to reassure myself, but to stay grounded in what was real. My obligations weren't abstract. They were written, enforced, shared. The next morning, an official notice crossed my desk. Standard language, no emotion. A step forward in a process that had already been moving. I acknowledged it and filed it where it belonged. When my father called again, his voice was tighter. "You're really going to let this happen?" "I'm not letting anything happen," I said. "I'm not stopping it." He went quiet. So that's it. I thought about the years of silence. About the pride that appeared only when it was useful. About the sudden urgency, now that consequences were real. "That's always been it," I said. I ended the call and turned back to my work, the same work that had brought them back into my life with expectations they never earned. I set the phone face down and reopened the document on my screen, scrolling to the section I already knew by heart. The language was precise, stripped of emotion and intent. That was the point. Systems like this didn't operate on motives. They operated on records. The inquiry moved forward the way these things always do, quietly, methodically, without announcement. There were requests for clarification, follow-up emails, timelines that tightened without anyone saying the word urgent. I responded when required, routed what I was supposed to route, and stayed in my lane. At no point did anyone ask me how I felt about it. That was a relief. At work, I kept my routines intact. Early mornings, clear priorities. No unnecessary conversations. I made a point of not changing my behavior, not signaling that anything unusual was happening. In environments like this, consistency mattered. Deviations drew attention. Attention raised questions. The questions didn't come to me anyway. They went where they were supposed to go. My family, on the other hand, escalated. My mother left a voicemail that started calm and ended brittle. "I don't understand why you won't even explain what's happening," she said. "We're your family." I deleted it without replying. My sister sent a message with a screenshot attached. An email header, redacted names, enough to signal that the situation had moved past speculation. Her caption was short. "This is getting serious." I didn't respond. My father tried a different angle. He called during the evening, voice measured like he was negotiating. "You know how these things look from the outside," he said. "Once something's in motion, it's hard to stop the narrative." There isn't a narrative, I said. There's a process. You're hiding behind policy, he replied. I considered that. I'm standing inside it, I said. He sighed, frustrated. You always did this, he said. Turned everything into rules. I thought about the house I grew up in, about how rules there had been flexible, applied differently depending on who they protected. No, I said. I learned what rules were for. He didn't have a response to that. The inquiry triggered a formal review. Formal reviews triggered notifications. Notifications triggered consequences that no one could soften by knowing the right person. That was by design. I sat through a briefing where ethical boundaries were laid out again, even though everyone in the room already knew them. The repetition wasn't for education. It was for record. Afterward, someone asked if I needed support. I said no. I meant it. The hardest part wasn't the pressure. It was the familiarity. My family had always expected me to absorb discomfort quietly while they recalibrated around it. The difference now was that I didn't adjust. One afternoon, my sister showed up at my office unannounced. She didn't make it past the front desk. Security called to let me know. I'll speak with her, I said. We met outside in the open, where there would be no confusion about tone or intent. This didn't have to happen, she said, skipping any pretense. If you'd just said something earlier, I didn't cause this, I replied. You could have prevented it. That's not how this works. She crossed her arms. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. I'm doing my job. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. You're choosing them over us, she said. I'm choosing not to lie, I replied. She laughed sharp and bitter. You always wanted to be different. I wanted to be left alone, I said. She left without another word. The review reached a point where outcomes were no longer hypothetical. Contracts were paused. Access was limited. People who had once returned calls quickly became unavailable. The family name which had carried weight in certain circles suddenly didn't. My mother called late one night. Her voice was tired, stripped of the careful tone she usually wore. We didn't raise you to do this, she said. You raised me to take responsibility, I replied. For yourself, she said. I thought about that. That's what I'm doing. She cried quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically. I let it happen without stepping in to fix it. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. The discomfort was real, but it was clean. No double meanings, no performance. At work, the inquiry closed one phase and moved into another. Paperwork was finalized. Decisions were documented. The system continued forward, indifferent to last names or family histories. I updated my files. I met my deadlines. I supported my team. No one treated me differently. That was the most telling part. The uniform didn't grant influence. It imposed constraints. Anyone who understood it knew that. My grandmother called on Sunday, as she always did. I told her what I could. They're angry, she said. They're scared. I replied, that too. She paused. You okay? Yes. Good, she said, because this isn't about punishment, it's about truth. I hung up and went for a run, letting the steady rhythm replace the noise. With every step, the same thought returned, unbothered by emotion. I hadn't turned my family in. I hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I had simply stopped pretending that blood outweighed responsibility. And the system once engaged didn't need my permission to keep going. I pulled into the lot a few minutes early and sat in the car with the engine off, watching people come and go without recognizing anyone. The building looked the same as it always had, neutral, functional, indifferent to drama. I checked my watch, then stepped out and locked the door. My parents were already inside, seated at a small table near the back. No menus, no drinks. They weren't here to eat. My sister arrived a moment later, heels clicking too loudly for the room eyes sharp scanning. Kara, my mother said, standing halfway and then sitting again, unsure which version of herself to use. I took the chair opposite them and set my phone face down on the table. What do you want to talk about? My father cleared his throat. This has gone far enough. That's not for us to decide, I said. My sister leaned forward. You don't have to act like this, she said. You know exactly what's happening. I know what's happening, I replied. I also know what isn't. My mother pressed her palms together. We're asking you to help us fix this, she said. As a family. I waited. Silence makes people honest. My father exhaled. Your sister made a mistake, he said. It doesn't define her. But the way this is unfolding, people are making assumptions. People are reviewing records, I said. That's different. You're being technical, my sister snapped. I'm being accurate. She shook her head. You could have picked up the phone. You could have said something before it got this bad. I didn't know before it got this bad, I said. And when I did, it wasn't mine to manage. My mother's voice softened. We didn't raise you to hide behind rules. I met her eyes. You raised me to accept consequences. My father frowned. That's not what this is about. It is, I said. You just don't like the direction. My sister laughed once short and sharp. So this is a payback I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was searching for words, but because the question deserved clarity. No, I said. This isn't about you. That's the part you keep missing. She stared at me. Everything is about us right now. Not to the system, I said. Not to the people reviewing this. They don't know our history. They don't care. My father leaned back, frustration showing now. You think you're better than us because you wear that uniform? I think I'm accountable, I said. That's not the same thing. My mother's eyes filled. You're tearing this family apart. I shook my head. That happened a long time ago. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were plain. My sister crossed her arms. So you're just going to let this happen? I'm not stopping it, I said. That's the same thing. No, I said. Stopping it would require lying or interfering. I'm not doing either. My father's voice dropped. If this ruins her career... It won't, I said. It will change it. There's a difference. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. My mother reached across the table, then stopped short of touching my hand. We need to know if you're with us, she said. I looked at each of them in turn. My sister calculating even now. My father rigid with expectation. My mother trying to pull the room back into a shape that had never fit me. I'm not against you, I said. I'm not for you either. What does that even mean? My sister asked. It means I'm not your shield, I said. And I'm not your advocate. My father stood. So that's it, he said. You're choosing this over your own blood. I stood too. I didn't choose this, I said. You did when you decided I only mattered if I was useful. The room went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Settled quiet. My mother's shoulders slumped. You don't owe us anything, she said softly, like she was conceding something she'd never offered before. That's right, I said. My sister scoffed. You think you're done with us? I think I'm clear, I replied. They left first, not in a rush, not dramatically, just one by one, gathering coats, straightening posture, reassembling themselves for whatever came next. I stayed long enough to pay for my coffee untouched and cooling. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. On the drive back, my phone buzzed. A message from my father. This didn't have to be this way. I didn't respond. At work the following day, nothing shifted. No whispers, no looks. The process moved forward with the same pace it always had. Files closed, decisions documented, responsibilities redistributed. That afternoon, I updated my emergency contacts again. I removed one name, then another. Not as a statement, as maintenance. My grandmother called later, her voice steady. You spoke your piece. Yes. And I meant it. She nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Good. Boundaries only work when they're real. I hung up and reviewed the schedule for the week. There was a briefing I needed to lead, a team member who needed guidance, work that required attention. The family drama didn't evaporate, it just stopped dictating my posture. By the time I locked my office and headed out, the decision had already settled into something solid. Not anger, not victory, clarity. I wasn't walking away from them in a moment of conflict. I was standing where I'd always stood without pretending that proximity equaled loyalty. And for the first time, the space between us felt deliberate, not accidental. I woke up before the alarm and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet that comes right before the day starts asking things of you. No buzzing phone, no messages waiting to be answered, just the steady awareness of where I was and what I needed to do next. The investigation wrapped the way these things usually do. No speeches, no dramatic announcements. Decisions were issued in writing consequences, applied in layers that didn't need commentary. Access was limited. Contracts were reassigned. People adjusted their bios and stopped returning calls they once answered quickly. The system didn't gloat. It moved on. At work, the only thing anyone cared about was whether the mission stayed on track. I briefed my team, reassigned tasks where needed, and made sure the people who depended on me weren't carrying uncertainty they didn't deserve. No one asked me how it felt. They asked me what came next. That suited me. My family didn't disappear overnight. They just became quieter. Messages stopped arriving with urgency. The group chat went dormant. A few emails came through weeks later, neutral in tone, as if distance might rewrite the past. I didn't respond. Silence had finally become mutual. One afternoon, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a framed photo from the ceremony clipped from the paper. My name was printed correctly beneath it. No note, no explanation. I slid it back into the envelope and dropped it in my desk drawer. Not out of spite, out of disinterest. The next ceremony came sooner than I expected. A promotion routine by Navy standards, but still earned. I stood in formation again, the process familiar, now the words precise. When my name was called, I stepped forward and accepted the insignia without thinking about who might be watching. This time, when I looked out into the small crowd, I saw my grandmother. She stood, straight hands clasped, expression calm and proud, in a way that didn't ask for acknowledgement. When it was over, she hugged me once firm and brief. "You did this clean," she said. "That mattered," I replied. We went to lunch at a quiet place near the base, nothing fancy. She asked about my work. I asked about her garden. We talked about normal things, the kind that don't need a backdrop to feel important. At one point, she said, "They'll tell this story their way." I know. "You okay with that?" I considered it. "They always have." She nodded. "And you, I'm done telling it for them." That evening, I drove her home and helped carry groceries upstairs. Her apartment was small and orderly, filled with light and plants that actually looked alive. She moved through it comfortably, like someone who'd learned exactly how much space she needed. Before I left, she handed me a folder. Inside were copies of letters she'd kept over the years, some from me, some from relatives who had asked after me without ever reaching out. She'd saved them all, not as evidence but as record. "You don't need these," she said, but I didn't want them lost. I took the folder and tucked it under my arm. "Thank you." Driving back, I didn't feel heavy. I felt settled. At work, my focus sharpened. The noise that had followed my family's return faded, replaced by the clarity of routine. I mentored a junior officer who reminded me of myself years ago. Quiet, capable, underestimated. I gave feedback without cushioning it. She didn't need that. She needed honesty. I took on a new responsibility, one that required longer hours and more judgment calls. I said yes without hesitation. This was the life I'd built brick by brick, without waiting for permission. On a Sunday afternoon, I updated my personal records again. Emergency contacts were current. Preferences were accurate. I added one line I'd never bothered with before, not because it changed anything, but because it reflected reality. Family Margaret Whitmore. I closed the file and didn't feel the urge to explain it to anyone. The holidays came and went quietly. No invitations. No obligatory calls. I spent the day with my grandmother cooking too much food and arguing about which movie to put on. It was easy. It didn't require effort or performance. At some point, she said, "You know you don't look like someone who's missing anything." I smiled. I'm not. That night back in my place, I laid out my uniform for the next day and checked my schedule. Meetings, training, a decision I'd need to make before noon. The normal weight of responsibility waited where I'd left it. Before turning in, I opened the desk drawer and took out the framed photo from the paper. I studied it for a moment, then set it back down. Recognition had come and gone. What stayed was the work. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel wronged. I felt aligned. The family I was born into had chosen their standards long ago. The family I kept chose consistency, accountability, and presence. One judged. The other showed up. I turned off the light and let the quiet settle again, not as absence but as space. Space to move forward without carrying what had never been mine to fix. If this story resonated with you, even a little, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos about family boundaries, quiet strength, and real-life awakenings. We're not here for loud revenge. We're here to live better, think clearer, and move forward free.